Hello, good evening. Dobro večer, lepo pozdravljene in pozdravljeni na današnjem predavanju. Hello and welcome to today's lecture. It's also one of the events of the final festival days of Oktober edition of Rdečih. I'm very happy to announce two guests today. They are well-known theorists in the field of feminist and anti-capitalistic field. First, there will be Jasmina Husanović. She teaches cultural studies at the Faculty of Philosophy in Tuzla. Her research field and interests include cultural studies, political philosophy, social theory, and anticipatory practices in the field of arts, cultural production, and knowledge production. Maybe if she will explain a little bit more about her, what she's going to talk about. After that, Lilijana Burcar from Slovenia. Jasmina Husanović is coming obviously from Tuzla, which is in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Lilijana Burcar is our second guest. She's from Slovenia. She's also associate professor of the Faculty of Arts in Ljubljana, where she teaches literature in the context of its social political ramifications. Her research interests include systemic feminist theory, anti-capitalism, neo-colonial studies, and social justice with focus on contemporary literatures and critical literacy. Enjoy in the lecture. After that, there will be also time for questions, maybe discussion, debate. So I wish you a pleasant evening.
I'm very pleased to be with you this evening, and my talk is going to concentrate on some lessons for feminist thought and practice today, because I'd like to map out only some specific political, social and economic conditions and technologies of governing their life or labor power through the politics. Sorry. Okay. Can you hear me without the microphone? No. Okay. So I'd like to map out some specific political, social and economic conditions and technologies of governing their life or labor power through the politics of emotions or affect in the public sphere in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the last few decades, and their outcomes at the level of everyday life in this post-socialist, post-Yugoslav, post-war, post-genocide democratic society. I intend to do that by contrasting two material experiences, insights and concepts of culturalized emotional governance: terror versus solidarity. The international governance of life in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we can extend this logic to the whole region, partly. So the international governance of life in the hands of ethno-nationalist and neoliberal ideological apparatus, and in the context of wartime and after-war violence and exploitation, reveals itself as the management of affect encircling the terror of the post-atrocity order, operating through various biopolitical strategies masked in the therapeutic paradigm of international community when handling BIH. So some of the most decisive sovereign inscriptions and ruptures have happened precisely across women's bodies and lives caught in this imperial and affective vortex of perpetual loss. The normalization of violence and deepening social inequalities are also reified in the changing technologies of governing female bodies, labor and experiences in BIH, in its often obscene regalia. I'd say that this betrays the twin logics of victimization and commodification, producing traumatically alienated forms of life, thought and labor, with dissolved capacity for political subjectivization and action. By charting the way through complex, effective politics, hidden economies of violence and oppression, and the normalization of terror as usual in the cultural production of femininity in BIH context, I intend to open up some investigations and some public efforts and critical interventions in the field of knowledge and cultural production, as well as activism. So I hope to be able to get to some of these lessons that are productive if we are thinking common and materialize effective solidarity by investing hope and labor in the politics of equality against this governing terror and its ideological outlet, a female ideal based on the ultimate precarization of female body and labor, life and thought. So life is governed through a culture of terror as usual, and I refer here to the term culture of terror and terror as usual as developed by inspiring anthropological work of Michael Tausig. So the sentence, life is governed through a culture of terror as usual, I believe aptly metaphorizes the material experience of precarious subjectivities caught in these multiple complex emergencies in Bosnia and Herzegovina affecting lives, labor and thought, everyday life. And Michael Tausig's term, terror as usual, is understood as something that through its irregular rhythms of numbing and shock constitutes the apparent normality of the abnormal created by the state of emergency. In BH, the state of terror as usual is created on the one hand by the effects of the war and especially traumas related to the continuous state of emergency, and this continuous state of emergency is partly, not only, related to the excavations of mass graves and ongoing traumas related to the missing persons, and on the other hand, by the continuous appropriations and governing of both the dead and the traumas of the living for the benefit of both ethno-nationalist and slash neoliberal politics. You can't see where one ends and the other begins. So mass graves, in this context, become the sites of continuous production of human waste that in turn becomes a site for governing the living. According to Michael Tausig, to understand our reality as a chronic state of emergency, as a nervous system, is to recognize its terror as usual, visible in the political art of the arbitrary, as a nexus of illusions of order congealed by fear and reproduced through an overarching obscurity between order and disorder, rule and exception. This apparent normality of the abnormal created by the state of emergency underpins, arbitrarily as I said, the core of social experience in Bosnia and Herzegovina for more than 2 decades, with unrelenting intensity and worsening political, economic and cultural symbolic conditions of life for its citizens. The past 2 decades have undoubtedly brought new forms of global governance that accompanied wars at the turn of the 21st century, forming a very complex development/security terrain and its multiple emergencies, which pose serious challenges to our thinking and doing of emancipatory politics. So various colonizing structures and agents within this development security complex in Bosnia and Herzegovina navigate the playfield embellished with banners of reconciliation, reconstruction, peace, development. These have also framed it as a place transitioning to something whilst undergoing post-atrocity, post-Yugoslav, post-war, post-socialist, post-conflict, post-Dayton ordeals. Bosnia and Herzegovina has become a stand-in for a community in need of intervention until the order is restored, and such intervention presumes various gifts handed to the country by the international community: democracy, capitalism, justice, peace. It is worth mentioning that this wave of postisms attributed to these operative discourses of governmentality and practices of statecraft in Bosnia and Herzegovina has been matched in the field of action by a team of other neoisms: neoliberalism, neocolonialism, neoconservatism, neofascism, neoracism. So I think we should switch in explaining our social reality from these postisms to neoisms. This paper also focuses on the possibility, I would like to discuss some possibilities for emancipatory politics that resist the politics of terror as usual and strives for the politics of hope. Such politics of hope is found in the intersections of critical pedagogies in certain sections of academia, arts and activism as collaborative sites of production of a different kind of knowledge. Some interesting projects of solidarity and hopeful politics give us an opportunity to rethink new modes of struggle against inequality and reclaim critical pedagogical conditions and visions of transformative politics. Most of my insights are based on individual and collaborative research, fieldwork and activism in the past 20 years through several formal and informal projects concerning the politics of witnessing to trauma in Bosnia and Herzegovina, former Yugoslav region and internationally, where various materials, corpora and methods of research have been used. Perhaps the key lesson of this personal and collective engagement has been to respond to the following imperative: to position ourselves critically in the academic and public work demands from us as scholars to engage in a specific art of diversion, which is the return of the ethical, of pleasure, and of invention in a scientific institution. Mission impossible at public universities at the moment, but I'll get to that. Producing such a setting, however, is a matter of collective intellectual and political enterprise and creative work in the horizon of hope, solidarity and social change. In these collaborative cooperatives of critical knowledge production, one must find response to the emergency-induced hysterias, numbness or acceptance around us, fighting against resentment, envy, nostalgia and despair as the predominant effective mechanisms of this culturalized governance of trauma and terror and regimes of knowledge that accompany them. So what follows is a contribution in this direction, a reflection on the governing of terror and trauma as well as on some potential select emplacements against such governance of life and death. A broad theme of many academic and activist platforms concerned with the politics of terror and trauma has been a critique of specific technologies of culturalized governance of life in Bosnia and Herzegovina, going hand in hand with productive public interventions concerning the politics of abject atrocity, trauma and terror in the last 2 decades. In my own work, I have engaged practices and discourses critical of the statecraft behind the so-called transitional justice industry paradigm, but it's an industry, and institutional and symbolic regimes, for instance, of governing the missing persons materially, or the persons missing materially, socially and politically, the dead and the living. There are symbolic geographies of loss and remnants inscribed in a no man's land between mass grave and ghetto. So, or from safe areas to ghettos today. The symbolic geographies of violence and terror are hard to illustrate despite the abundance of empirics. They are, however, perpetually lived in the bodies of those caught in the vortex of various operative discourses, narratives, regimes and technologies of this governance, squashed in this clinch of ethno-nationalist and neoliberal forms of authority operative in the public spaces in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is an apocalyptic site, actually, worse than it was in 1993 in a way, considering the, not only perpetual loss of human bodies, capacities, and material resources spiraling down for more than 20 years, but also serious fractions when it comes to solidarity in everyday life, much bigger than even in the conditions of war, in a way. In a foggy business of terror as usual, new heuristic tools are required to discern those operative technologies of governing people, like, for instance, codification in science, law, and identity politics, and the way in which they permeate everyday life experiences, cultural production, and forms of life in BIH. How then, through knowledge production and public activism, are we to challenge the institutionalized imaginaries which quilt around signifiers and materialities of mass grave and ghetto as metaphors for, mass grave is a metaphor for human waste produced by political violence, or by identitarian politics in this case, both globally and in the post-Yugoslav context. So critical lessons of the politics of witnessing to trauma of the missing, which emerge from this context, should come from the fieldwork engaging with emancipatory gestures that think and act against the traumatic technologies and regimes of power in international and national politics enacted in BIH. And so take that the lessons, and we want to contextualize these practices in the field of knowledge production, critical pedagogies, art and social activism. We have to concentrate on the contributions of significant contributions of feminist politics and theory in this direction and activism, which radically question the merging of ethno-nationalist and neoliberal regimes of power and violence into so-called ethno-corporate regimes, through specific post-atrocity orders of governance, and these ethno-corporate regimes basically colonize the whole spheres of public and everyday life. I start from the assumption that the field of cultural production and knowledge production is a battlefield for the public good and transformative potentials for the politics of hope, rejecting precisely what the ethno-corporate regimes do. They foreclose the horizons of possibility and plausibility, and to turn it backwards, how are we to resist the very politics which produces this foreclosure, the terror of racist, colonial and patriarchal technologies of the human exemplified at the level of everyday life. So in the academic sphere, that public universities, let's say, that suffers from the usual symptoms of post-atrocity order, evident in various public institutions, including universities in BIH, a challenge to talk and teach about subjects, such as difficult subjects, such as the culture of trauma or the politics of terror, without perpetuating the same kind, the same logic of violence, remains largely unanswered. What indeed can be seen as emancipatory in knowledge production when the social logic of commodification extends to all common goods, including university and knowledge, using even within the university strategies of ghettoization, to govern labor power and life, precarious life necessary for production and consumption. The position of students and critical educators in public universities, which are caught in this ethno-corporate matrix of feudal struggles in heartless institutions, attests both to the precarization of labor, cognitive labor, and our capacity for public collective action, as well as to the management of us as precarious subjectivities in the public sphere and labor market. In the complex emergencies besetting the academic knowledge production and its agents, neoliberalism and its body, ethno-nationalism, neoliberalism once again appears as a theatre of cruelty, a mode of biopolitical governance through cultural politics that produces new forms of subjectivity and particular forms of conduct through its own cultural politics of subjectification and self-regulation. Giro's ideas, Henri Giro's. In academic spaces intersecting Bosnia and Herzegovina, neoliberalist governance comes in this, in a double act with another theatre of cruelty, ethno-nationalism, which has already produced ethno-religious identity-based forms of subjectivity and ensuing forms of conduct, leaving devastating consequences for the horizon of education in the educational sector. So what has to be stressed is that neoliberalism, hand in hand with ethno-nationalism in Bosnia and Herzegovina and wider, has become a pedagogical force. So it's not only an economic theory and political regime, it also neoliberalism is a particular public pedagogy. So it has become a pedagogical force which threatens any critical thought and action, mobilizing all pores of everyday life to legitimate its norms, values, institutions, and social practices, and normalize its regime of common sense and reductive notion of political rationality. So neoliberalism has to be understood and challenged as both an economic theory and a powerful public pedagogy and cultural politics, which violates and exploits in the actual contexts of precarity our universities, workplaces, streets, communities, in order to dissolve our capacity for political action. Neoliberal, ethno-nationalist and racist public pedagogy and cultural politics is evidently on the increase in the post-national Europe too, dissolving our capacities for transformation. So many transversal practices, subjectivities, or emancipatory potentials resist this dissolution, reclaiming some visions of transformative politicality and sociality in the public field. But, this is, not much considering the I would say that extremely difficult and radicalizing situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for instance. But when they do appear, these interventions, they are they're precisely at these intersections of art and knowledge production, social activism, and critical pedagogies. So I will quote Giraud here in his imperative. Under the reign of neoliberal globalization, it is crucial for intellectuals and others to develop better theoretical frameworks for understanding how power, politics, and pedagogy as a political and moral practice work in the service of neoliberalism to secure consent, to normalize authoritarian policies and practices, and to erase a history of struggle and injustice. The stakes are too high to ignore such a task. We live in dark times, and the spectre of neoliberalism and other modes of authoritarianism are gaining ground throughout the globe. We need to rethink the meaning of global politics in the new millennium, and part of that challenge suggests the necessity to recognize that equality and freedom, class and culture are ineluctably linked. Doing so offers educators and others the possibility to take new risks, develop a new vitalized sense of civic struggle, and exercise the courage necessary to reclaim the pedagogical conditions, visions, and economic projects that may, say, promise of democracy or in the promise of equality or a different future worth fighting for. So, lessons from from some of the experiences of actual struggles to repoliticize the current governance of trauma and logic of commodification. What can be these lessons? Lessons of working in social institutions in the hands of ruling regimes, and lessons of intervening into the knowledge production on the margins, in these interstices, escaping the political and economic rationality of these recognizable deliverables or usefulness, etc., present in these dominant matrices of governing. What is the position of these valuable remnants of subjectivity, sites, and struggles that hold emancipatory potential, including feminist thought and practice? I will quote Frank Seeberger here in his insight that it is only as such remnants, or at the level, or at that level of ourselves, where each of us is just such a good-for-nothing, ready to be discarded remnant, that we can be encountered in our pure singularity, our ipsity, to distinguish it from our identity, which is always a matter of social construction and symbolic investiture. So only through the struggle with and within this remnant position, human waste, can we realize the traumatic fact that we are always already human waste, whose economic and political value is that of usable bodies objectified through fears of having no protection by state, nation, or capital, staring in the face of the political art of the arbitrary, or this terror as usual. So bare life as labor power, precarity and migration, violence and waste are the facts of our everyday life, in the clutches of the dominant political imagination, whose hidden ciphers remain wavering between ghetto and death, between safe zones and mass graves. Perhaps then it is time to put the spotlight on the ipsity of our labor, to start from the very capacity of the body exploited for the purpose of profit to catch the threads of emancipatory politics. In the context of our plunging transition, for the bodies and for the remnants of our sociality, politicality and solidarity, where and when do we dare ask about the economies and geographies of exploitation surrounding remnants of genocide? Recycling bodies and erasing bare or precarious life as a trade in humanness or humanity around us are difficult questions, and this knot between capitalism and its logic of extermination. So how to deal with the abject affect which floods over in excess when we unravel the stories and uncover the political economies around us. To answer to the politics of atrocity, racism, inequality and terror will not be found, definitely, in the institutional academic space, public university now. Rather, the focus of our attention have to be specific, critical and social spaces and practices that produce hope, equality and justice as indications of affirmative and universal politics of new subject. We witness those spaces, as they emerge in this triangle of art, knowledge production and activism, at the locations where we produce theory in art, or art in theory, and school in both of them. This is one of the concepts developed within the Yugoslav Studies platform on Konjuh plenary session in July 2009. But I have many more of these empirical examples. I'll get to them, I think, now, hopefully. We find them so in critical interventions by a new wave of public workers engaged in the field of theory, art and activism in post-Yugoslav spaces, whose work is underexplored in current academic research. For instance, in this sense, particularly significant and productive have been interventions by Kooperativa Front Slobode or Grupa Spomenik, dedicated, to investigating the politics of memory of the wars of 1990s, and some of their work on the politics of memory and genocide investigate limit points of a range of discourses like science, law, forensics, bureaucracy, and the repoliticization in theory, art, and activism. One example is, for instance, the project Menza Pre-Association, around engaging with the issue of missing persons. Then a series of public events in the region and internationally instigated by Kooperativa Front Slobode in the last 2 or 3 years. And I will mention one, for instance, several interactive public performances in Banja Luka during the Spaport Biennale of Contemporary Art in 2010, engaging with the selected works of poetry, autobiography, theory, and contemporary art. Which is particularly important because you proved the impossible. You proved that you can actually talk in a very productive way, in an unusual setting in Banja Luka about genocide. And usually, this is like we can't have a dialogue. We can't talk about this without actually falling back into some kind of identitarian logic. So this, this is not a big thing in a way, but it does attest to the possibility of a different idiom in which we can speak about really difficult things when it comes to the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and come into solidarity after that and act upon our political affects encircling the most traumatic points of current social reality. Most importantly, it produced the circulation of knowledge as transformative social practice, enabled at least mobility between people, which, that's a difficult thing, even to have mobility of students, on horizontal level in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So students from Banja Luka and Tuzla, especially, of feminist and leftist orientation, so they can come together and work together. This has been a big struggle in the last 5 years. At least. So basically, a certain circulation of knowledge as transformative social practice, facilitated, various efforts, passing beyond this event itself. Of course, as I say, all of these things are under researched and definitely not archived, definitely not written about, but they are happening, etc. So, and it's a bit beyond the scope of this paper to go now into all of that. So, the imperative that I want to talk about, which remains ahead of feminist and leftist when it comes to reconnecting feminist and leftist or feminist and anti-capitalist practice, remains to continue the search for a community of equals that intervenes into difficult subjects through a reinvented classroom as activism, or activism as a classroom, or community as academia. So those interventions, which include a common work of theorists, students, activists, citizens, are an act of knowledge production where we build the stage to frame the story of a new adventure in a new idiom. The effect of the idiom cannot be anticipated because it calls for spectators or active interpreters who render their own translation, who appropriate the story for themselves, and who ultimately make their own story out of it. What had to be done was a work of translation, showing how empirical stories and philosophical discourses translate each other. Producing a new knowledge meant inventing the idiomatic form that would make translation possible. I quote Franskier here. But indeed, talking about genocide and capitalism and level of everyday life in Bosnia and Herzegovina means inventing a new idiom, new form. It's about form. So the task is clear. How are we to find the forms of action which engender the political subject struggling for equality today? And when we have to do some radical groundwork precisely at the sites of greatest antagonisms, and precisely at these sites of greatest antagonisms, we have the emancipatory potential shining through. Authentic political interventions opposed to the culture of terror are those practices that set up this possibility of political subject, which traverses ventriloquism of the official politics and public, and their continual, bloodhounding ideological operations for the purpose of further impoverishment of the public good. I always remember the 18th Brumaire, Marx, when he says, that two bloodhounds of the new order appear, the policeman and the priest. So yeah. Testifying collectively to the potentiality of the promising politics includes particular strands of academic, cultural, activist production, which share a particular pedagogy. So they testify to and resist, violence or terror as usual around us by turning experiences of trauma into critical insights of hope. Because it's a matter of, how can we attribute creative ability to the loss? And through insisting on the emergence of emancipatory political subject in relation to dominant regimes of governance and accompanying forms of political authority. In our own ghettos, taking shape in particular laboratories of hegemony, neoliberalism, rise of fundamentalism and fascism, masculinization, ethnicization, racialization, militarization of the world, as well as feminization of poverty. There are still many things that propel us, affirming the postulate, Kristeva's postulate, I revolt, therefore we are still to come. So, when working with people in this art of the ordinary or making the impossible possible, one becomes acutely aware of the multiple dimensions of this loss of sociality and politicality, with voicelessness, which results, with also this invisibility of political subject of change. So, in this sense, the emancipatory charge, with various degrees of political visibility as a resource of critical knowledge and social practice, is reclaimed, as I said, by the engagements that we have to map out. New optics and registers of intelligibility in the field of art and cultural production will often intervene productively against the biopolitical interests in relation to colonization of history and future, colonization of our experience, body, humanity, and everyday life. And these new radical social imaginaries exhibit particular politics of witnessing that somehow navigates this triad between bare life or precarious life, sovereign power, and the biopolitical nomos of the new empires around us. They also oppose this confiscation of experience and memory, resisting that which constricts critical thinking and intellectual life today. Several questions, many questions to be asked, but I will mention a few. How do these emergent social imaginaries and political gestures struggle with the loss of the ability to speak, of the loss of the capacity for language, which means in turn the loss of belonging to the world as such? In which direction do they modify, or do we modify this loss in order to bring us together, communify us against the identitarian politics through new languages of political action and new collectivities? How do these voices and subjects probe the paradoxical impossibility of justice, coping with critical traumatic contexts of political reality, since it is always from the face, from responsibility for the other, that justice appears. So, and also some of these ideas on capital and language, and that we need new language and new idiom to communify us. I took inspiration from Christian Merazzi's work, Capital and Language, from the new economy to the war economy. I think it's a very important book. So. The language of art, for instance, offers radical kinds of witnessing to trauma that at the same time reveals the contingent nature of the forms of political and social organization. The politics of affect here strikes directly at the very political sovereignty of the nation state as a mask for the reorganization of old and new elites. In this unstable field of oscillation of culturalized political emotions, what counts as transformative? So one of the ideas, one of the implications of Michael could be that a certain practice can have an emancipatory charge only if it responds to this loss of the capacity for language in such a way that it rejects the language of sovereign power and of capital, and if it turns loss into something that brings us into communality through affirmative political imaginary, and against this perpetuation of the politics of atrocity that produces human waste. And capitalism is the politics of atrocity, not only genocide. So if it offers cultural readability, intelligibility of the proper places and proper languages, intended for those excluded in a way from the res publica through political violence, corruption, impoverishment, and banality. So, let me see. I just want to shorten this a bit. So only interventions, and platforms which think commonality and solidarity differently in the context of these technologies governing the humanness and the management of the human and the production of human waste through political, economic, and social violence, can we engage with the scar of the mass grave against the perpetuated terror of inequality in everyday life through hopeful politics. And such trajectories and networks of hopeful politics should revolutionize our lenses and senses, because their engagement with the questions of abject affect, revolt, and collectivity today brings into the field of visibility and intelligibility this very question of emancipatory politics after the catastrophe of experience that overcame us in recent decades. So the coming critical pedagogies for feminist and anti-capitalist thought and practice should, in my opinion, focus on the practices of critical analysis that engender different forms of classrooms. Classroom is follow Rancière here. Classroom is an emancipated community, which is in fact a community of storytellers and translators. There is a strong legacy in our region of actors and spectators in this communal space of knowledge production, transforming the relationships of inequality into a community of equals. However, their work on producing knowledge in an emancipatory classroom, such emancipatory classroom, has to be furthered. So in this respect, it should be wedded to complementary and particular strands of feminist theory and psychoanalytical post-colonial theory, which basically frame this space or produced such classrooms, enable them, materialize them in the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina, precisely around these untouchable, difficult subjects. And at the same time, this is a matter of social movement in the field of knowledge production, which must be the site where we resist the politics of terror as usual, and this logic of commodification and exploitation of dead and living. By undergoing, we have to do this by undergoing ideological inoculations, ourselves, reclaiming, the means of knowledge production, and assuming a different relationship to our labor which is necessary, absolutely necessary for social change. So the conversations have to bring together a complex world of audiences, their stories, passions, and experiences into such public classrooms, framed as a community of equals, where we together produce maps of knowledge and action, articulating a triple search for the subject, agent, and collectivity, one, for the space of intervention, and for the vision or imaginary of this change. And I will actually stop here and just say why in the title that I changed for this lecture I am mentioning word double take BIH, which I actually came up with together with my colleague Damir Arsenijević. What do we mean by this double take BIH? That our two key tasks are to uncover the blind spots of dominant feminist and leftist perspectives on BIH and on the region, and there are many, which are politically debilitating and which further dissolve our critical capacity for thought and action. And that's a double take. One is to uncover the blind spots, and the second one is to insist on producing practical hope in the context of terror as usual, which is the real state of emergency that feminism must produce today.
Does it work? Yeah.
I have been asked to give this lecture in English, so I will comply with the order, so to say. What I'm going to deliver today is, but I can't see the text now when I have the mic in front of me. So what I'm going to deliver today is also a modified version of a presentation I gave in Zagreb in October, because I believe it is necessary to repeat the basics several times and to take these basics from one context to another, from one audience to another. So the first two-thirds, are going to be perhaps familiar to some of you, but the last one is a new edition, and of course the contribution proceeds slowly, then it escalates and finally erupts. Okay. Over the course of the last 20 years, the countries of East... Can you hear me better if I speak with the mic? No. Yeah. No, come on. Okay, thank you. So, over the course of the last 20 years, the countries of Eastern Europe and former socialist Yugoslavia have been subjected to intense processes of repatriarchanization. Repatriarchanization, or redomestication of women, refers to the structural processes which push women back into the isolation of their homes as economic dependents or semi-dependents and freely available childcare providers who lack basic economic and social rights. This in turn undercuts their agency, autonomy and political power, reducing them at best to another category of secondary citizens. Now, as I have already pointed out before, in a different context, repatriarchanization is a direct consequence of the orchestrated shock and awe destruction of socialism and the forceful neo-colonial imposition of capitalist social relations. Contrary to the common belief promoted by liberal discourses, patriarchy is not incidental to capitalism, nor is it merely a separate and parallel system that supposedly only runs alongside capitalism. Rather, institutionalized patriarchy, not just patriarchy in general, but institutionalized patriarchy is capitalism's mainstay. It is one of its key structural features and operating principles. In its accumulation of privatized wealth, capitalism is directly dependent on patriarchal subordination and gendered exploitation of women. Now I'm going to show in the second part how this works. Now, of course, we need some general layout. And this is this is the historical knowledge and understanding that has been obliterated and, of course, swept under the carpet over the last 2 decades. We all know, if we remember, we will know then that it was industrial capitalism that reinvented and consolidated patriarchy to its own advantage, of course by putting in place, as Miles says, new patriarchal structures and ideologies. In other words, it was industrial capitalism that introduced the institution of the nuclear patriarchal family, and it put in place the concept of the breadwinner model, thereby one-to-one economic dependency of women on men, and thirdly, the doctrine of 2 separate spheres, the so-called private and public domains. This resulted in the splitting of formerly common socio-economic and political space into 2 seemingly separate, but in reality dependent and also intersectional, in fact unified spheres of so-called productive and reproductive labour. These 2 spheres and categories of work were not only artificially split from each other, but also hierarchically reorganized and therefore differentially valorized according to the newly instituted gender division of labour. So let us remind us that in this process, men as a newly created category of either wage workers or capital owners were allocated to the field of a very narrow definition of productive labour or work. Women, on the other hand, were excluded from it and consigned to the newly established separate sphere of reproductive work. All of this was done on the basis of redefined constructs of masculinity and femininity. In this process, women were once again denied the attributes of reason and rationality, and thereby the ability of abstract thinking, which became now the exclusive preserve of man. In this way, women were rendered particular. I'm really schematizing here. This is very, very basic and it's a typical overview. So, women were rendered particular so that they could be treated as an aberration from the norm. And in the famous quarrel about women, they were equipped with intuition instead of reason. They were reduced to the body and reunited with nature. Once women were reunited with nature and confined to social reproductive work within the seemingly isolated privacy of their homes, their enforced child and elder care and imposed duties of household maintenance and nurturing obligations could be easily redefined as not proper and hence not really productive work. That is, the kind of work that does not need to be paid or remunerated. This is of crucial importance for the understanding of capitalism and its forms of capital accumulation through the creation of non-waged and highly exploited free carrying and domestic labour of women. In its extra accumulation of wealth and its privatization, capitalism is directly dependent on patriarchal subordination and gendered exploitation of women. And it is for this reason that capitalism keeps reinventing patriarchy and also the breadwinner model alongside conservative constructs of femininity and masculinity. This is one of the primary modus operandi of capitalism. So it does so regardless of different forms that capitalism itself might take, because for capitalism always rests on the redefinition of social reproductive work as non-work and therefore as a matter of private and individual concern rather than social and collective responsibility which needs to be properly financially supported. This is the basics. Now, of course, social reproductive work is of essential importance for the production of future labour force and maintenance of the current one. But by redefining it as a matter of private concern and carrying burden associated solely and entirely with women as a newly created secondary group of people, and by declaring this kind of work to be not a proper socio-economic activity, but merely an extension of women's supposedly feminine nature, and has the kind of work that is by necessity done out of love and for free, capital owners avoid the social responsibility and thereby the financial costs that go along with it for the maintenance and reproduction of humanity in general. So in other words, by transferring the cost of social reproduction to a specifically designated group of people, in the capitalist case, women, on the basis of constructs of femininity, capital owners not only avoid but download the huge financial costs that are associated with the reproduction needed for the reproduction and maintenance of their own future neighbor force. And this translates into a direct increase in their own private wealth. It's a very simple equation. Now, it is for this reason, of course, that capital owners in need of workforce do not recognize women's assigned task of production and reproduction of the worker as a socio-economic activity. Instead, they mystify it as a personal service extended on the part of women as part and parcel of their imputed nature and supposedly naturally occurring and repetitious work to be conducted solely at home. Now, and so once again, it needs to be borne in mind that precisely by transferring this huge cost entirely onto the households and onto the shoulders of women, capital owners in this way subsist on the free reproductive labor of women. Women in turn actually subsidize the capital owners. Now, so as a result, women in capitalism are constructed primarily as home-confined domestic carers and services, and at best as mothers' housewives working outside home, that is, as secondary workers. This means that once women are, by necessity, partially readmitted to the paid labour market, women's paid work is conceptually restructured so that it comes to be regarded not as equal and complementary to that of the male member of the household, but merely supportive and supplementary to it. In other words, women are perceived as merely secondary earners, that is, as a huge reserve army of labour confined mostly to the informal and semi-formal sector. So once again, it needs to be repeated, capitalism rests on patriarchal support. It is in this way that capitalism rests on patriarchal subordination and gendered exploitation of women, and it feeds off highly conservative constructs of masculinity and femininity. Women's imposed unpaid reproductive and underpaid productive work is central to its processes of capital accumulation by means of what we can say gendered dispossession. So, any kind of significant change in gender relations requires a systematic overhaul of the socio-economic system that generates structurally conditioned and gendered inequalities. That is why, to paraphrase Teresa Abbott, it is not sufficient to ask how gender operates, without also asking why it operates the way it does. So if we restrict our analysis only to the question of how gender functions, this inevitably results in a very myopic vision, the kind of myopic vision that draws attention to fragmented and isolated issues of culture, for example, while it actually neglects exactly the structural causes of gendered hierarchies that in fact also, by the way, produce that culture. So once gender is abstracted from socio-economic relations and hence organization of society, it becomes dematerialized. It becomes dematerialized into free-floating, that is, decontextualized instances of multiple and on the surface seemingly unrelated, individually conceived oppressions. But as pointed out by Balibar, and I quote here, sexism is not just an enforcement of difference or even less appreciated work roles for women. No more than racism is just xenophobia, as racism is meant to keep people inside the work system, not eject them from it, so sexism intends to do the same. Okay, so this is not just about cultural issues, of course. So capitalism feeds on the structural exploitation of differentially segmented and hierarchically organized labor force. But with its gendered division of labour, which it reinforces strictly, and the shifting of the burden of social reproduction entirely onto the shoulders of women as they assign free labour, which is justified on the basis of constructs of masculinity and femininity, it positions and affects men and women differently. It does so by locking women within the structures of private, so-called breadwinner patriarchies, and I'm going to explain this later on. Perhaps this seems something out of the blue, something unimaginable, because we have lived in a different system and we cannot actually imagine that women even nowadays, of course, exist within a breadwinner model, which is a template to Western forms of capitalism, regardless whether it is neoliberal or whether it is the old type of the industrial capitalism, so to say. So, in other terms, as women are knocked into the structures of private, so-called breadwinner patriarchies, and these under capitalism are always subject to constant readaptations and new enforcements. Now, of course, let us remind ourselves of socialism, and this is a standard take. Socialism, of course, represented both state socialism and, of course, a self-management model. Socialism represented an important breakaway from this pattern. As some of us might know, this was made possible only through the implementation of a systematic change. So socialism brought about a new identity, possibilities of self-realization and attitude to women. How? It dismantled the institution of private patriarchy, the breadwinner model, that is one-to-one economic dependency of women on men. And this one-to-one economic dependency of women on men is inevitably also predicated on the loss of women's physical and emotional autonomy. So socialism dismantled this by granting women the entitlement to a full-time employment on a permanent basis, out of which women, unlike their Western counterparts, could for the very first time derive important individually based social rights, such as access to social benefits, social security, full health and pension insurance coverage, fully paid maternal and parental leave with accompanying child benefits, and a guarantee of re-employment in the same job position as prior to their maternity leave. This is something, of course, and it is a standard sentence that I use now. Perhaps it's become my label, I don't know. So this is something that women in the West could only dream about. Socialism bestowed upon women a full economic and social citizenship. It secured their financial autonomy and economic independence. In turn, this gave women an important leverage in family-making decisions as well as economic self-sufficiency. And coupled as this was with accompanying individual social and political rights, it made it possible for women to also establish and run their own family units independently from men, most importantly, without risk of poverty. Now, women's access to universally available full-time employment, socioeconomic independence, agency, and full citizenship could only be guaranteed, of course, by socialising the costs of reproduction. Childcare and elderly care, and thereby the social reproduction of humanity, became a matter of a shared public responsibility, and therefore state-subsidised policy, and more than that, equal distribution of commonly generated income that would be diversified or channeled into appropriate social services rather than being hoarded by individuals, as is the case in capitalism. So socialist states erected an extensive structural framework to support the emancipation of women. And this was reflected in the extensive network of affordable public childcare facilities, including nurseries, of course, creches, kindergartens, and after-school care facilities. This was something unique, almost unique to, we might say, to socialism, and in addition to that, all of this was topped with affordable school lunches and other social programs which were aimed at communal dispersal of child caring responsibilities. The communal school lunches, for example, were introduced in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. The idea was also to lift the burden of domestic household care, actually. So the idea is that actually children eat out in public facilities, so this would actually unburden the women. And of course, as we know it, in the other system, women would actually come back home from work, children would be provided for in terms of their food, and what would be left to cook would be primarily just one meal per day. Okay. Now, okay, so all of this stood in stark contrast, and still does, to the so-called Western democracies, which after the Second World War, of course, far from doing away with the breadwinner model, have simply modified it. In this way, they have kept the socio-economic structures of gendered exploitation, women's systematic subordination, and second-class citizenship very much intact. This is primarily due to the absence of, or a very limited and sporadic availability of public childcare facilities. The famous Swedish model, the Scandinavian model that is unionized nowadays, of course, nobody will tell you that women were not employed, that non-women were forced to be employed and still are on a part-time basis, primarily because of the lack of childcare facilities or their unequal distribution. So Sweden itself, as you can see from, can you see?
No.
No. What do we do? Full screen. Full screen, slideshow. Can you see better now? Okay. So this is the 1970s, and of course later on the 1990s. And you have an overview right here where women, of course, are, for example, in Denmark, 46% of women would be kept in part-time employment. Finland 10%, but most of them would also be required to stay at home for a certain period of time. Then Norway, Sweden, 46% of women working part-time, primarily because of there being a lack, of course, of childcare facilities. So Western states have thus upgraded the traditional breadwinner model to the so-called 1.5 breadwinner model, with a woman only precariously and intermittently employed in temporary or part-time jobs supplementing the income of the male household member. Sweden, for example, would also have put in place a particular kind of taxation system. So on the surface, it would actually enable equal opportunity of access to jobs. But for example, at the same time, it would provide an incentive for women to work part-time and therefore to primarily take care of children at home rather than in facilities which were either scarce, non-available, or not that well distributed, by introducing a joint taxation account. So you could have an individual taxation account for every single member or adult member of the family, but you could also have a joint taxation account. And the joint taxation account would actually provide tax, tax levies or alleviations, tax levies for women who work part-time. So it was in order to, so tax levies would be actually provided, providing that you actually work part-time. But the tax levies were not that high, so they were very minimal, so, right? Okay, so in contrast to socialist states, full-time employment and hence socioeconomic independence has been the preserve of only a handful of women in the West. And this has also been coupled with very low paid or non-existent maternity and parental leaves. The United States does not have a paid parental leave at all. To take, for example, Germany, prior to unification, the statistics show that only 44% of married women in West Germany were employed, out of which only half were employed full-time, which amounts to only 22% of all the women in West Germany. So, they received salaries that were only 65% of men's, while their Eastern married counterparts at this time could boast a 90% full-time employment rate. So, it can't be more obvious. Good. At the same time, child care leaves still today are not covered in Malta, Cyprus, the Netherlands, Ireland, Portugal, Switzerland, Spain, Greece, the the UK to a certain extent. In Italy, for example, parental leave allowance is as low as 30% of a woman's income, net wage, by the way, while this 5-month maternity leave allowance accounts for 80% of the woman's earnings. In Finland, parental leave allowance extends up to 70 or 75%. In Sweden, it reaches 80%. This is just a schematic overview because this takes another lecture to understand how maternity parental leaves work and different types of social welfare states in capitalism, which of course never give you 1% remuneration. Well, anyway, so to finish it off here, in this way, so Western capitalist states have kept the socio-economic structures of gendered exploitation, women's systematic subordination and second-class citizenship very much intact. So much about the historical context. And now if we focus on the so-called transition from socialism to capitalism, this transition, of course, is a euphemism for regression. It stands for a massive rolling back of essential socio-economic rights, but this affects women differently from men. The reinstallment of capitalist social relations rests on the processes of repatriarchalization, which is most clearly evident in the dismantling of the socialist welfare system and its extensive network of public childcare facilities. Different approaches have been taken. In Poland, for example, childcare facilities would be literally reduced overnight. There would be a massive shutting down of these facilities, because this was the policies that would be pursued by the Czech Republic. Well, anyway, so social benefits that included maternal and parental leaves for women have been drastically reduced or restructured to minimize or do away completely with a financial input that would otherwise be required on the part of recently fledged capital owners. So substantial reduction or elimination of fully paid maternity and parental leave works in favour of capital owners, as it helps to keep the taxes on corporate profits and other private profits at a minimum. And out of this, in the 1990s, comes the mantra, pregnant women or mothers-to-be, they are a cost. Okay? Precisely because the capital owners shed the financial input necessary for the reproduction of their labour force. In other words, this contributes to the greater accumulation of private capital, be it that of corporate entities or small business enterprises. Maternal and paternal leave allowances have been either substantially slashed, so that in some cases they amount to only 40% of individuals' average earnings, or they have been reduced to the level of sick leave compensation, which categorically aligns pregnancy with disease. And in some post-socialist states, such as Poland, they have been simply annulled for the majority of women, which puts the Polish women in the same predicament as those in Ireland, the United States, Switzerland, Greece, and the Netherlands. No parental leave whatsoever paid. Now, this makes women in post-socialist countries more and more economically dependent, either on their wage-earning partners or on other family members. At the same time, the period of parental leave for women has been also extended up to 3 or 6 years in certain countries, of the child's age, that is, because public childcare facilities have been at the same time either eliminated for children up to 3 years old. Poland is the Hungary or the Czech Republic. Well, these are bookcase examples, or they have been drastically reduced in number and only partially replaced by sporadic private care facilities and the remaining public care facilities. But now both of these categories of care facilities charge exorbitant prices, and of course, especially private care facilities remain out of reach for the majority of women. Now, these protracted periods of unpaid and no paid parental leave, and also a complete lack of or only a limited provision of publicly funded childcare, has a double negative impact on women's socioeconomic and political status. As capitalist regimes, which are based on the privatization of care, place the childcare responsibility squarely on women's shoulders, and in the process abandon them to scarce and non-existent childcare facilities and other resources, they effectively force women to exit labour markets to tend for children in various kinds of forms, while these very systems perversely present this move as women's or mothers' own choice. Now, these structural changes enforce and naturalise the position of women as economically dependent partners and carers. At the same time, these childcare regimes, which once again we need to bear in mind are marked by lack of publicly available and affordable facilities and by extended parental leave policies in certain cases, they force women into specifically precarious forms of work, and they give rise to the feminization of poverty in post-socialist states. In this way, women's paid work is restructured as secondary, while their income is reconceived as merely supportive and supplementary to be spent on basic daily food provisions and other elementary household goods. So what we have installed in place is a certain version, what is creeping into place is a certain version of a breadwinner model, which is becoming more and more similar to one and a half breadwinner model as introduced in Europe after the Second World War. Now, as women are more and more saddled with full-time childcare duties, they are rechanneled into the kind of forms of work which are also characterized as mommy tracks. In socialism, you would never ever have two separate tracks of jobs and one track that would be defined as a mommy track. Never. So these mommy tracks include types of job which are dominated by part-time work or home-based wage work. Now, Croatia, for example, introduced part-time work for mothers in 2004, and it was followed by Slovenia during the first Janša government under the pretext of women-friendly policies. Part-time jobs, of course, are a phenomenon specifically targeted at women in capitalism after the Second World War and represent one of the earliest forms of unprotected, flexibilized labour, which is highly profitable for capital owners. Part-time workers are exempt from the labour laws that pertain to full-time employment, which means that they are subject to little or no job protection, as we very well know nowadays already. They are also subjected to poor work safety and employment standards, and of course depressed or below minimum wage compensations. So part-time workers put in mostly from 20 to 30 working hours per week. The median hourly earnings are on average only 2/3 of those working full-time on the same job, or even less than that. Unlike full-time employment contracts, part-time jobs offer no fringe benefits or perks, such as a regular pay rise, bonuses and job-related rewards. Part-timers working overtime are not eligible to an overtime compensation. The stipulation, of course, is that one must first put in 8 hours of round-the-clock work, like a full-time worker, to be eligible for overtime reimbursement. This premise can also differ across countries, but the idea is to keep the wages low, to keep them depressed. And just as importantly, part-time jobs do not include, or they severely limit, workers' eligibility to work-based social security benefits. And this is most clearly reflected in reduced or non-existent health, pension and unemployment scheme coverage for these workers. In Canada, women working part-time, they are not, so the employers do not actually contribute towards the unemployment benefits. So once women are laid off as part-time workers, they are not entitled to unemployment benefit. And this is one way of increasing the private capital on the part of the capital owner, but this is actually the money that, of course, we create for that owner itself, or himself or herself. Now, where am I? I'm really getting a bit, very angry. Now, So workers in flexible part-time jobs also work long and irregular hours, usually with no fixed daytime schedule. So in British shops in England, of course, this means that you can start at 8 and work till noon, or you can start at 9 and you can work till 2, regardless of the opening hours of the kindergartens, which might be opened anyway, just for 4 hours, by the way. But these part-time jobs, working hours do not actually coincide, do not necessarily coincide also with the opening of the kindergarten facilities. Now, so in addition to being unstable and low paid, part-time jobs are also dead-end jobs, and that's why part-timers constitute a reserve army of secondary earners or secondary labourers. So these jobs allow no place for further skill development, as Dennis has pointed out, or transport training or job advancement. So in this way, they effectively cement women's newly assigned status of devalued secondary workers in the formal sector of the capitalist economy. So now, one thing we have to remember about the quota system that is so eulogized and so eagerly endorsed by liberal feminists, who do the quota system work for? The quota systems in terms of politics, when you want to enter politics, so you have the quota system. If you are stuck with this kind of a job, do you have the financial resources and other kinds of things to be able to qualify as part of this quota? Isn't this also a sort of we might say, internal colonization on the part of those women who can afford to do this at the expense of those who can't because they are part-timers? Okay? So part-timers are thus constructed as an extremely cheapened and devalued labour pool, which alongside the restructuration of childcare regimes serves to compound women's economic and social marginalisation. It inevitably results in the feminisation of poverty. But that is not all, because of course there is another system, or a parallel system, that has also been benevolently introduced for women in capitalism, which is, if you can't work in public as a part-timer, why don't you stay at home and work as a home-based worker? So the second form of precarious work, which is targeted at specifically at women, and introduced alongside this transmutation of capitalist social relations and privatisation of childcare, is home-based work for women. So women who work at home, because they are structurally forced in, they are at the same time, the idea is that, women can work at home, and of course the problem of childcare and the non-existent childcare facilities can be easily solved. So women work from home and take care of children. But this means that women are structurally forced to incorporate full-time childcare. It's full-time childcare, housework, and possibly also elder care, should there be an elderly member of the family in the home, into their working schedule. And they are treated, of course, as self-employed. But in reality, as we know, these women do not own their capital labour. They are dependent wage subcontract workers to whom labour-intensive parts of production are farmed out by intermediaries or big companies themselves. This was a common practice in Greece, it was a common practice in Spain in the 1960s and the 1970s, and it was the German companies that would organize this home-based, through the intermediaries, and they would organize home-based workers, housewives, basically in Greece and in Spain. So Greek women who were forced to stay at home because of this lack of childcare facilities, they would be forced to stay at home, and it was the textile industry, the textile industry, the gown making industry, that would profit greatly from this the periphery that Germany created for itself at the expense of Greek women who were confined to her. Okay. So these had deliberately downsized, these companies had deliberately downsized, as we know, their own factory floor production, and they have made their production leaner, and in the process they have outsourced the most expensive, that is labour-intensive parts of their production to those who, once placed in the privacy of their homes and atomised in their activities, are constructed as informal workers who are no longer, of course, protected by standard labour laws. Home-based waged work includes both industrial home-based work, primarily for textile, apparel industries, but I will not go into this. The idea is that you also have service home-based work, such as data processing, clerical work, done by a home computer, telework and information service, packaging, labeling, and so on. So anyway, home workers represent the most exploited and the least protected category of labor. Home workers are paid at least 40% less for the same kind of work performed by their counterparts in the formal sector of the economy. The woman who works as a dressmaker, or the woman who works behind a sewing machine on the factory floor, who's already minimally paid because her work is considered to be secondary, she will receive 40% more than the same kind of the woman who performs the same kind of work, does exactly the same kind of pieces behind her sewing machine at home. 40% less. Women, of course, are not paid at an hourly rate, but on a piece rate basis, and so they are paid by the number of finished items they make, which also translates into a very low pay that falls below a minimum wage. And this is further exacerbated by the fact that minimum quotas are deliberately set so high that it is impossible to meet them without working well beyond the regular working time, and sometimes, of course, sub-employing your own children in their free time. So, at the same time, home workers have to buy and maintain the machinery to keep the production going without any compensation paid on the part of the employer, or they have to borrow the machinery from their contractors in exchange for monthly service charge, as for example pizza order takers who must rent computers and modems from their employer. So it's a further double exploitation. So what is the point? Once home-based wage workers are categorized as self-employed, their employers also avoid the responsibility for covering their social and other workers' benefits, such as paid sick leave, parental leave, annual leave, redundancy compensations, and so on. In other words, the costs that should be incurred by the employer are transferred to home-based workers, who thus come to subsidize their own employers at their own expense and through their own structurally imposed self-exploitation. Now, this kind of feminization of homework is a structural feature of capitalism, which also defines home-based work as not real work, but merely as an extension of full-time domestic and childcare work done by women in their homes to supplement the family income. The focus is on supplement. So once defined as not real waged work, even though it is exactly that, but merely as a sort of an income-generating activity of lesser importance, performed seemingly in addition to housework and childcare, women's home-based waged work can be easily portrayed as not requiring the same kind of remuneration as the work of a standard worker. At the same time as home-based workers are removed from the formal into the informal sector of the economy, this also helps to naturalize the gendered division of labor. Namely, it cements the notion that women are naturally and primarily tied to domestic and care work, and they do some income-generating activities on the side. So what should be public responsibility for childcare is thus once again individualized and translated into, to quote Karagata, a personal problem for the mother, unquote. So, or in other words, to quote Karagata, as more women perform their paid work from home, which is also touted by the way as a women-friendly policy, the childcare crisis, and the cost for which should be also shouldered by capital owners, disappears as a public policy issue. It is the woman who, to quote Karagata further, experiences a personal crisis while the public issue fades from view, safely hidden by her presence at home as both mother and home-based worker regardless of the impossibility of her task, unquote. So in other words, by shifting the burden of childcare onto women and into the privacy of their homes, capital owners are once again exonerated from social responsibility and the financial input needed for the reproduction of their own labour force. Now, why am I saying all this? Because I would also like you to see how this discourse is nowadays also is also justified by the media themselves, So this is the way the introduction of part-time work would be actually encouraged in Croatia. And these are the arguments in inverted commas that would be provided in, they actually give you the idea that part-time work is a welcome institution that women should actually eagerly embrace. Now, I have many more things here, but I need to finish, right? 5 minutes more, okay. Now, with the destruction of socialist state and reintroduction of capitalism, we're also witnessing a new phenomenon, an increasing inequality among women themselves. It is only well-to-do mothers in top positions who can secure full-time employment, but only by outsourcing domestic and care tasks to the so-called caregiving markets. This, of course, only partly replaces extensive networks of public and affordable childcare facilities. So, in the face of the dismantled public care facilities and social provisions, the integration of women into top positions in Western industrial society proceeds primarily on the basis of a broadening of informal feminine working conditions in the home economy. So this means that the households of the newly rich and their children's welfare are being sustained by an army of underpaid, devalued and unskilled women working for less than a livable wage in precarious working and unprotected conditions of the informal sector. Croatia, for example, now has introduced the Institute of Private Childminders. So the childminders home. And this means that this is one more incentive to dismantle the public sector, so to annul, do away with at least minimally protected jobs, and to move women even as childcare workers into the privacy of the house. Now, this policy is officially pursued by a capitalist state, which of course in the process of downloading the constant labour of social reproduction onto the households has also undertaken the necessary measures in the form of legislation bills, disciplinary practices and coercive and discrimination labour laws. For example, in Spain, the most recent debate revolves around how are we going to alleviate the problem of the lack of childcare facilities? Let's import nannies from Africa and let's import nannies from Asia. So we have to pass the kind of laws which will make this kind of labour precarious, just as well. But this is aimed at the top segment of the women, primarily because the others still work part-time, they work as home-based workers, so these policies are restrictive, they're oppressive, but at the same time they are meant as a form of alleviation just for a certain segment of top women, so that they will not ask for systematic change with their power positions. Well, okay. So despite all these restructurations that have hit women hardest, the capitalist state has been adept at churning out images of women's limitless opportunities of employment and fulfilling identities, endless possibilities of success and empowerment, provided women should only try hard enough. And you can try hard enough if you go for a retraining program for a private child nanny, and this is retrying. You have to retry. In other words, you have to apply with the structurally enforced changes. So part-time and home-based employment policies aimed at women are touted by state agencies, as we see here, and their corporate donors as women-friendly policies, which enable women to reconcile their full-time household and child care tasks with paid employment, supposedly granting women choice and a form of economic and social empowerment. And this kind of propaganda could not be further from the truth. It also misleadingly and deliberately represents the inevitable and structurally conditioned failure of the majority of women as a matter of their own personal shortcomings and character deficiencies, thus also effectively pushing from view the socio-economic structures that shape these very possibilities. To conclude, the point of these women-friendly policies is to exonerate capital owners from the social responsibility and huge financial costs necessary for the reproduction and maintenance of their current and future generations of labour force. This leads to a huge accumulation of private capital by the so-called gender dispossession, that is, dispossession conducted at the expense of women themselves. The point of these policies is to preserve the status quo and leave capitalist patriarchal structures and modes of capitalist exploitation intact. Women-friendly policies in capitalism are, interestingly, not dubbed equality policies, but perhaps just policies of equal access. For this shift from merely formal to substantive rights would require, as we all know, a new revolution. So what is really called for in place of women-friendly policies that help to maintain the status quo then is, to quote Grorina, a concrete redefinition of socioeconomic structures, for it is these structural conditions that ultimately determine women's position and role in society. Thank you.
Jasmina and Lilijana, thank you for these things. Maybe we have some questions, comments?
Excuse me, this is not, I'm not suggesting this as a solution. On the contrary, I'm just trying to nail out what is awaiting us in this part of the world. Nobody thinks about what part-time jobs really mean. Nobody thinks about what home-based work really means, because these are new institutions that we were not familiar with before. So the idea is that I do not insist on this. I'm just trying to point out what is there in store for us if we don't start thinking in terms of structural changes. This is the idea. And these are the neoliberal policies that are being imposed upon us, and precisely they are touted as women-friendly policies. And the idea is to make people accept part-time work for women and home-based work for women, something that is naturally adherent to women, because somebody needs to take care of children. And if the kindergartens have been gradually dismantled, so who's going to take care of children? And this is not the natural state of affairs. It shouldn't be. Part-time jobs and, of course, home-based work, this is not the natural state of affairs. What I'm pointing out, I'm pointing out how limited capitalism for women is. I am not touting this as a way out. Of course, this is one fraction, because there is a lot to say and systematize, but I have been asked to focus on this, namely, what are the most drastic changes that will affect women as a result of the imposition of capitalism. And these are two very specific institutions that have been part and parcel of women's employment in the West. I am not in favor of this, and I will never go by it. A state is not an abstract entity. A state does not exist above us. A state is around us. A state is us. A state is a community. We had community care facilities, and people were certainly not alienated in the sense that there would be competitive edge, money edge. It would not be like that. And state, of course, this is another stance of, I might say, liberal feminism that artificially separates state from the people. We are the people. We are the state. What kind of state do we want to have? But what is happening today is people are taken out of the elderly homes, the homes for the elders, because it's impossible to pay for the services there. The houses are being confiscated, and it results in emotional violence because women are burdened with extra care they cannot handle. And it results in also, we know this, we have reports of increasing psychological abuse because both parties cannot cope.
I'm just going to share one association I had, just to show the monstrous side of this breadwinner's logic or argument that we have in capitalism and therefore in various forms of international authority, including transitional justice. I don't know how familiar you are, I guess not that much, with the Rdečih case, where basically he was sentenced for genocide in Srebrenica. But I want to tell you the story behind it. At Rdečih's trial in The Hague, the argument of the defense was that it's not a genocide because only men were killed and women were not killed. But this is not the end. It's not genocide because the definition of genocide is that you exterminate the whole group of people on the basis of this, blah, blah, blah. So the prosecution on the other hand, decided to take up the following argument. Women in eastern Bosnia are deeply patriarchal, and they do not function in the public without men as the breadwinner. Therefore, once the men were killed, they were also killed in a way. They were headless. That's the argument. I mean, read it, and many feminist organizations were absolutely appalled by this, including those that were expert witnesses like Vive Žene, etc. But that's the argument. Yes, the community was killed because the men were killed, and therefore women were decapitated because the men were like the main breadwinners and those providing for the family and basically having contact with the public. So, basically, even in that sentence, you have, like, in the prosecution argument, a very problematic statement. So, what else? Maybe some, but when it comes to poverty, I mean, Bosnia and Herzegovina, 40% people unemployed, 40. Young people, 18 to 35, between 70 and 80%. The job, the number of, vacancies.
Job posts.
Yes, probably half the number that we had before the war, despite all the aid from the international government, which was largely to reform, privatize and finance the international empire in Bosnia and Herzegovina, obviously not to produce jobs or repair the economy. So, yeah, that's it.
Okay, then I will once again want to thank both Jasmina and Lilijana for their contribution to this festival and also to today's evening. Thank you.
Thank you.